Babylon's Fall, worst game of 2022. Terrible. A Square Enix mega failure. 40 out of 100 on Metacritic. A stain on Platinum's legacy. Money-grubbing CEOs entirely out of control. But now, it's dead. It's over. Good riddance. Alright, before we talk about Babylon's Fall, I want to talk about video game discourse for a minute. I've been talking about video games on the internet since I was 14. Now, I'm in my 30s, and while I'm far from the oldest commentator out there, I feel like I've become increasingly jaded about the discussions surrounding video games as they're released. Every year, at least a few titles get bullied and picked on. Some probably deserve it more than others, but it inevitably becomes a month-long dunking session where each wave of commentary in the gaming echo chamber amplifies negative expectations and feels more focused on belittling a game over everything else. This often results in many people digging in on prevailing narratives about a title's quality being objectively bad without having played it, or more importantly, giving much thought to how negative elements realistically affect the overall experience. For those who absorb and regurgitate this information, it's not their fault. It's impossible to play every video game, so we make many conclusions based on the narratives around us. When there's an aggressively negative sentiment spreading between media, influencers, social connections, and our closest friends, it's easy to solidify our opinion in a way where there's basically no room for discussion, despite us working on secondhand information. I'm not saying the sources of these negative opinions are wrong, stirring the pot for attention, or have an ulterior motive. Most of the time, their experience is totally valid, and depending on what they value in games, it absolutely makes sense they wouldn't be happy. The titles most likely to receive the gaming community's ire often have flaws and fail to meet expectations, or they may be doing something different from the norm and don't meet a shared understanding of what makes a good game for mainstream audiences. It can even be built on a foundation unfamiliar, so people will take these design decisions they don't understand and boil them down to the developer simply being stupid because they lack the context of why they were even made in the first place. In the modern day, how we consume these opinions also matters. Brief emotional outbursts clipped from a video, someone's contorted face in a thumbnail, an aggressive headline, a quick tweet, or a mocking joke can remove the conversation's nuance while still impacting how we feel about a game and the commentary surrounding it, even if that original voice doesn't intend for that to be the only part of the discussion you hear. This amounts to an often very toxic environment, where few are willing to show empathy for a game, its creators, or its few fans. The extreme go as far as to verbally attack developers directly, call reviewers out as corrupt, or harass communities simply because they express their enjoyment. My hope is that this is often the minority that often gets overblown. However, this toxicity manifests itself in the larger community in more subtle ways. Often proclaiming you like one of these games is led by people trying to figure out what's wrong with you rather than listening to what you value in that experience. Are you biased, a fanboy, or a contrarian? These questions often feel more important than hearing about what you liked in a game. I doubt most people mean any harm in this line of questioning, but when a game is accepted as almost objectively bad, it's almost like your reasoning for liking it are never good enough. Not everyone is equipped with the right words to convince others to think otherwise. It took me the better part of a decade writing articles, videos, and rambling on podcasts to really start to hone into the point that I think people will at least hear me out. Thankfully, as the years go by, the oppressively negative air slowly starts to dissipate, and those dug-in positions begin to soften. I wouldn't say I'm a retro game YouTuber, but focusing on titles outside of their release window is a much more comfortable environment because often those audiences are willing to listen, likely because they're no longer looking at the title as only a consumer product. Instead, they see it as an analysis of a historical piece or a work of art. The conversations that lead video game releases almost always fall around the question of whether it's worth $60, if it's free of bugs, minimizes frustrations, or, in its simplest form, guarantees a great time after getting home from a stressful day at work or school. Honestly, I think that's a very reasonable way to look at them. But the voices that engage in these conversations in the online gaming community often are people who spend a lot more time discussing games. I suspect most of them see games as art. If you're watching this video, I almost certainly expect that you do too. That's a great thing, and I feel increasingly there's an appreciation of gaming history. People are spending more time than ever consuming analysis of games. Stories about the lost and forgotten titles, genres, and developers are being retold and reevaluated for larger audiences. It's an exciting time for retrospective gaming commentary. However, it often feels like a title still has to cross a threshold before it crosses over from being a product into art. And that bar is at its highest at release. In my eyes, this initial product-focused discussion can be skewed to the point that it muddles the conversation. It gets nasty, with dramatic shows of people exclaiming the final product is overpriced, has deceptive marketing, or is an all-out scam, when it often just didn't meet their hype and expectations. I'm not necessarily saying having this more product-focused discussion is a bad thing, or that you shouldn't express your feelings. On launch day, most players experience titles with similar values in mind, so naturally, these tidal waves of coverage and reactions will be dominated by opinion of those shared values. Low Metacritic scores don't happen out of nowhere. They're a snapshot of how contemporary reviewers and audiences collided with the game at launch. These conversations are meaningful, acting as invaluable records for when in the future we have to ask questions like why Earthbound, a beloved classic now, failed so miserably at release in the US. No one at the time was wrong. The whimsical nature and cartoonish graphics simply didn't match the trend of the US industry at the time. In these moments, design decisions that were right, wrong, ahead of their time, backwards, innovative, stagnant, or any other label don't matter. The reality is, it's how it was received, and that's what impacts gaming history and paints the future. But the values of the gaming audience changes. Eventually, new voices may come around to convey what they appreciate about a title, and may even change the conversation to be more favorable among a larger audience. That's not to say every game will be magically received better as time goes on. It may even get worse. Castlevania 64 received positive reviews at release, only to be scrutinized by many prominent gaming influencers a decade later. It's taken almost a whole other decade to recover its image, and thankfully today you'll find many videos singing its praises. We'll see where it goes from here. You might think it's ridiculous to even include the likes of Babylon's Fall in the same conversation as an Earthbound or Castlevania 64, but it's almost impossible to know which titles will finally get their due and when. I never thought Sonic 06 would be looked back on fondly, yet here we are today, with at least a segment of the Sonic fanbase re-embracing it and even trying to iron out some of the warts themselves. This movement can also be bigger than individual titles. Japanese games in the West were stigmatized for an entire console generation. The entire romantic adventure genre was undermined here until the last decade. I still see prominent voices in the industry still trying to gatekeep them, asking if the genre is even worthy of being called a video game, often criticizing their place in the conversation alongside what would be considered more traditional titles. Thankfully, many of these types of games are now getting their due. Babylon's Fall is still fresh, so knowing where things go from here is hard to say. Though in its dying breaths, I took time to play through it. While I do want to talk about what I think is valuable in Babylon's Fall, more importantly, I want to address the complicated question of what went wrong, how that changed the game, and who's to blame. Because as unique as Babylon Fall's challenges were, the problems that plagued the conversation surrounding it are all too familiar. If for some reason you never learned what Babylon's Fall was, here's a quick rundown. It was a multiplayer action RPG, structured similar to something like a Monster Hunter game. The player starts in an instance-town hub, accepts quests from a board, then sets out on dungeon runs. Instead of focusing on hunting down a single monster, the player went through zones while clearing rooms of enemies, so the combat sections felt a little closer to like an online Phantasy Star game or a Diablo, where the journey matters more than the finale. Platinum Games, which is known for their character action games such as Bayonetta, Metal Gear Rising, and Astral Chain, were the developers behind this title, and it showed. The combat was often combo-driven, with each encounter ending with a combat scorecard, giving various rankings that add up to the final score of a mission, like many of their other works. Babylon's Fall, as a loot-driven action RPG, offered a decent amount of diversity in its weaponry. Light swords, sweeping axes, heavy hammers, magic staves, and bows made up most of the lineup. Guns were also added in Season 2 with a rhythmic timing element for rapid-fire shots. though how these weapons were used is a part of what sets Babylon's Fall apart. Babylon's Fall feels like it originated from Platinum Games' work on the Nier franchise. The original release was an action RPG from 2010 by another developer known as Kavia. It mixes grounded Zelda-style combat with bullet hell elements. This can not only be seen in the enemy attack pattern, but also in how the player uses their floating book companion who would launch magic bullets himself. When Platinum Games got their hands on the franchise with Nier Automata, they disconnected this mechanic from the player character, allowing these skills to be utilized freely even if the protagonist is already attacking. The concept was pretty much the core of Babylon Fall's gimmick, as a mechanical parasite was attached to the player's back and ingrained in their nervous system. This parasite held up to 4 weapons. 2 of the weapons manifested in the player's hand for light and heavy attacks, while the other 2 would float behind the player character and could operate independently of their actions. This meant that they could be used basically at almost any time, while dashing, mid-combo, or even when knocked down. All weapons could be equipped across any of these 4 slots, often changing their movesets and functionality. This created a large diversity of combat styles. While the back slots can be used for various purposes such as applying buffs and manifesting a floating shield, I found their core strength was in dealing damage, either through a flurry of ongoing slashes using a sword and axe swipes, or, my favorite, charging a hammer or bow to deal large spikes of damage. However, these back slots often consumed large amounts of the player's SP meter, which is also utilized for dodging. So the weapons in the player's hand acted as a way to maintain their SP level while also controlling the enemies. A stance system also unlocked later that would modify each weapon slot further, offering options for balanced, combo-driven, or staggering-based movesets. Beyond how these weapons felt to play, an intricate underlying passive buff system was tied to all equipment. Depending on its rarity, 1 to 4 additional effects were applied to each piece. This is more than just static and flat bonuses, instead providing options for enhancements that would heal, buff, and increase maneuverability for either yourself or even your entire party. A key part of these buffs was also how they were activated. They often felt like they were built into simple player actions. They may apply from jumping, after dashing a set period of time, from dodging, attacking from the air, using a move a certain number of times, or simply by positioning. While it's a bit hard to convey exactly how these enhancements would apply by listing examples, I think the icons flashing in and out of view at least conveys the chaotic nature of these enhancements. There is a ton to consider here with your equipment for your playstyle. With the right setups, you could find combos and movesets that best use these enhancements. It was a system that felt built around use case over pure stat progression, which is often a common trap of loot-driven affairs. Executing and adequately managing all these elements efficiently was incredibly challenging. It often felt like doing finger gymnastics to fully utilize all 4 weapons, while putting yourself in the right situations to activate your enhancements. They took the foundation of what makes Nier's combat distinct, while creating a deep system with a lot of room for growth and gear optimization. In isolation, I view it as a success of Platinum Games melding its combat into a loot-driven action game. Obviously, there's more to a game than its combat system, as much as I did like it when you put all the pieces together. Seemingly, Platinum Games' inexperience in the loot genre had a major impact here. Gear score, the number that represents the level of equipment, is overemphasized. While I personally have this issue as a mechanic in almost all loot games, here it felt incompatible with the combat system. Building loadouts, optimizing playstyles, and prioritizing complementary enhancements was almost completely undermined by the need to push this single number over everything else. Failing to do so would limit the increase in gear score, and choosing to ignore this number for the sake of playability would handicap your ability to progress. Though it is an issue that likely resolved itself once hitting the gear score cap, as you would no longer need to drive that number up. But at least in the final days of the game, that would take dozens of hours to get there. I rarely saw this brought up as a major issue in most reviews, so while this is a main issue with Babylon's Fall for me, I don't necessarily think it plays into the big narrative of why this game failed. So let's talk a moment about the live service elements and how those had a negative impact on the game, though my reasoning for these problems likely is different from what you've heard. Babylon's Fall was launched with the promise of content updates, seasonal events, cosmetics, battle passes, and all the like. If you've played any modern video game, you've likely heard or interacted with some or all of these. One of the key aspects of live games is that they're constantly evolving. The developers tweak, add, and remove content to maintain a freshness to keep players engaged most months of the year. It's a tricky space to navigate, but successfully doing so provides a huge payoff to the company and the players. Reoccurring revenues are some of the most valuable in the industry, and fans get a steady flow of quality content that keeps a consistently enjoyable gaming experience they can return to year-round. Having a community that plays and talks about the game is essential, as the large player base attracts others and helps keep it feeling lively for the current player base. A vital aspect of this model is player feedback. Their responses help inform future changes. It's a crucial piece in keeping the community happy, your game entertaining, and the revenue flowing. This feedback sometimes pushes against the developer's vision for their game. They can either stand their ground and say the mechanic was designed as is despite the complaints, or cave, making changes to appeal to the player base. What's the right decision here is often subjective and has to be approached on a case-by-case basis. Ideally, the best solution maintains the sanctity of the developer's vision while making their customers happy. I believe this feedback loop is where Babylon's Fall stumbles. One of the first things to come under scrutiny with Babylon's Fall was its visuals. I'm not going to pretend here I know painting or, game development terminology, so forgive me if I mess any of it up here. The developers aimed to create a distinct painted canvas style aesthetic that used various techniques such as overlays that replicated the bristle marks from a brush. To complement it, the texture work was smudged and blotched in different ways based on the canvas weave. To show this, I'm using promotional screenshots. Here, it's an elegant look, and if you can't see the details, you might need to view this video in full screen on a computer with the resolution cranked up. I think anyone looking at these screenshots could see why they would pursue this aesthetic, though as pre-release promotional shots, they were handpicked by the PR team because they looked the best and didn't necessarily represent what was ever even in the game, and it definitely wasn't how it looked in the final release. Playing Babylon's Fall was an incredibly visually inconsistent experience, with certain scenes being as clear as any other game, others retaining the more paint-splotched visuals, and some applying the brushstroke overlay. Sometimes these were combined, other times they weren't. By the last update for the game, there was often no real rhyme or reason as to when or why these effects were applied, often feeling like they were only left because they were too hard to remove from a scene. So why the patchwork design? Well, there were complaints about visibility during the early beta testing phase. This promotional screenshot might be a good example of where this would have gotten in the way. You can see just how undefined this enemy is, with all the filters applied over him, likely making it hard to read what their weapon was or what they even were. Being able to clearly read and respond to enemy attacks is important in a game like this. I'd imagine this would only have been worse in motion, but it's hard to say. Unfortunately, I couldn't find much footage from this period. Square Enix did provide a few trailers and live streams, but it's clear all these uploads fell victim to streaming compression issues. YouTube destroyed much of the finer details. Though I personally even found it pretty hard myself to clearly capture the games with the elements that were left in it. I'd imagine uploading this video now, YouTube compression isn't doing them much favors either. Admittedly, I was only playing it on a PS4 and capturing at 1080p, so maybe it's not the clearest image in the first place. Though every Babylon's Fall video I found seemingly suffered the same consequences, 4K or not. Either way, the feedback from the early beta tests caused most of the aesthetic layers to be stripped away in an attempt to improve visibility without fully reworking the aesthetic. This likely resulted in the final look with its bizarre inconsistencies. The one decent comparison piece is a video uploaded by Square Enix. It's also compressed, but it shows just how that texture detail was changed. And it seems likely that many of these elements that were smudged and blurred in the original look for the title likely weren't reworked and just kind of put in plain view, even if they were never meant to be seen that way. Does this explain all the visual issues? No, the character models never looked fantastic. Though, especially in the modern day, few video games seem to prioritize pure technical quality. In the case of Babylon's Fall, it's clear the artistic approach was meant to set it apart over any sort of technical prowess. Though as a positive to the patchwork removal of this original aesthetic, some scenes in the final game still held on to almost the full set of filters, and even after launch there's an interesting change of heart where they re-implemented a lot of these elements into the post-mainline story, with static scenes from select angles reapplying many of these layers. Both provide brief glimpses into how this aesthetic may have been applied in real time if it were left largely untouched. While these scenes were far from perfect, these were the moments where the game looked its finest. The difficulty was also a major source of scrutiny. In its final days, many encounters in the main story felt unfulfilling. They rarely required the player to utilize the main combat mechanics. This results in a lot of battles being easily handled through simple button mashing. Enemies melt in seconds, and unique boss mechanics were often completely missed as they would die well before additional phases would begin. Similar to the aesthetics, beta feedback also plays a role here, the game's difficulty being lowered multiple times throughout its lifespan. There seem to have been some more direct changes up front, but other elements were also tweaked later on that likely had an impact on it as well. One of the most noticeable to me were the area gimmicks. Initially when the game launched, each dungeon seemed to have some sort of additional challenge beyond combating enemies. Underwater combat slowed player movement, encouraging them to stay above water. Slippery ice required momentum to be considered when attacking, and poisonous miasma required the player to maintain a barrier while fighting. There were likely more, but it's hard to say without rewatching someone's entire playthrough, because while these were in place at the game's launch, they were later removed. The result is that every dungeon often felt the same, as little else exists to differentiate them beyond aesthetics. The dungeon obstacles that did survive these cuts often do so little damage, it's easier to ignore them than engage with them. However, I couldn't find any concrete proof of whether these particular elements were a part of any rebalancing. Was it right to make these changes? It depends on who you are. I can deal with visibility in favor of maintaining a unique art direction, put up with dungeon gimmicks for the sake of variety, and can take the time to learn combat elements to play through the main story. But as a live service game meant to keep players grinding hundreds upon hundreds of hours, visibility is more important than visual novelty. Playability matters more than dungeon gimmicks, and fast-tracking the player to the end game is more important than challenging them up front. Though I'm not blaming the community for all these changes, the feedback they received addressed legitimate issues, and the people providing it likely were those most invested in the game's success. What is the problem in my eyes is how all these changes were handled. Real solutions would have found ways to balance difficulty without undermining the combat. They would have changed dungeon mechanics to be friendlier for fast-paced grinding rather than removing them. And they would adapt the aesthetics in ways that weren't simply peeling away the layers until only a shell of the aesthetic is left. Like most people talking about Babylon's Fall out there, I'm not privy to any of the behind-the-scene details, but it feels like a live game where no one driving the experience had the resources available to make the changes they needed to correct the direction, nor the freedom to make judgments about whether the changes would have actually improved the experience, ultimately making a worse game for someone like myself who could appreciate it despite its issues, while also not truly solving the community's problems and failing to draw in or maintain its player base. The tweaks here seemingly compromise its original vision by solving them in the worst ways possible. And to me, that is the greatest negative impact the live service aspect has on Babylon's Fall. Wait, what were you saying? What about the microtransactions? This is one of the biggest complaints I heard about Babylon's Fall as a live service game. It was a full-price title that required an online connection, had a paid battle pass, and included real money microtransactions. PlayStation players also got the bonus fee of needing PlayStation Plus. That's a lot of pricing models shoved into one video game. A bit more than usual for sure, however, I wouldn't say unheard of in the modern day. but the conversations surrounding these elements often lack nuance and in my eyes are overblown, focusing more on the existence of these elements than their implementation. When I start hearing pay to win tossed around without any real solid examples of it beyond the fact that the game has a paid currency, I start getting really skeptical. And when Babylon's Fall was launching, I was on particularly high alert due to another controversial Square Enix release around the same time. Chocobo GP, the Nintendo Switch entry in Square Enix's, I guess now, series of Final Fantasy kart racing games that started on the PlayStation? After many years and a canceled 3DS entry, Chocobo GP launched basically the same week as Babylon's Fall. It features many Final Fantasy characters, particularly of the Chocobo Fables variety, along with a magic system that are a pretty neat variation on the Mario Kart formula. However, the game was trashed in the online discourse for being $50 with a battle pass and having microtransactions. Again, a lot of cries of pay to win, at least it's a competitive game in this case. But the big drama was that Final Fantasy VII's Cloud was locked behind the battle pass. Now there's a lot of weird wiggle room, free currency, and a lot of stuff that lets you get Cloud without paying money, but for the sake of extremities, let's just say you can only get Cloud by paying $8 or whatever it was and leveling up the battle pass. Does that suck? For me, it kind of did, though again, probably not in the way you'd expect. Chocobo GP's gameplay, in my eyes, just doesn't really meld well with the Battle Pass, and the progress of the Battle Pass was locked to GP mode, which in my eyes is one of the worst parts of the game since it takes forever to get from race to race. Speaking of which, Babylon's Fall Season Pass as a gameplay feature is not particularly good either. For myself, a game needs significant variety to have a fun battle pass, and Square Enix actually has successfully done this before. Square Enix's late battle royale, Final Fantasy VII The First Soldier, had tons of progression elements distinct to it thanks to its Final Fantasy blood, which made its pass fun to grind, paid or not. But instead, the conversation around the battle pass and Cloud got boiled down to this is a bad, pay-to-win, incomplete game, a sentiment that fully hasn't dissipated yet, as I still rarely ever see anyone discuss the game itself when it comes up. Does Cloud really matter that much? Obviously, he's an important Final Fantasy character. If you're a hardcore Final Fantasy VII fan, or maybe just a Cloud fan in general, I can understand the frustration and even passing up the title because of it. But shaming and demeaning an entire game on this one character's exclusion, if we stick to Season 1 content, there's 24 stock characters to choose from. We're gonna ignore Squall for the sake of keeping this example simple, though he is also free too. So looking at the roster of 25 characters, Cloud is like this much. He's a tiny sliver, and while he has his own unique special move, so do each of the 24 other characters. And when you consider Chocobo GP as a video game as a whole, Cloud becomes an even smaller part of that experience. Look at how tiny he is. Though I definitely understand the optics of this, and feel Square Enix is also partly to blame because the messaging was really focused on the Battle Pass, the GP mode, which is the first option on the menu, and the fact that Cloud was a part of it over everything else. Cloud is no Mario. Still, it would be really weird for Nintendo to put Mario behind a paywall in Mario Kart. Though from a gameplay perspective, Mario himself not being there would be almost entirely irrelevant. But people would absolutely act as if half the content was missing, so I understand why this was the reaction and became a surface level scandal. But you know what is cool? Terra's dad is in Chocobo GP. Cloud is in so much other Final Fantasy garbage. If you're a real Final Fantasy fan, you will appreciate the inclusion of Camilla's paw. All joking aside, I think people are very bad at measuring the impact of these monetary models on games. They see this bullet point list, scoff, and do everything they can to undermine the title in their mind. There's a great conversation to be had about the problems of modern video game monetization, how they exploit fear of missing out, manipulate our perception of odds, or cover up the real costs of rolling for our favorite JPEG. Whose responsibility it is to see through those elements is vague. In the US at least, though it is a reality of the modern industry. I can fully respect someone who doesn't want to support these methods by deciding to boycott a game they could potentially love, but the important thing is to make sure your ire is pointed at the right thing, not dragging down everything and everyone related to a game for the sake of your personal justice. My personal approach, support the game, not the microtransactions, but you draw your own line. Chocobo GP is also a great example of why it's important to make your voice heard, or at least avoid spending money on elements you hate. Future Chocobo GP seasons did make all new characters earnable in-game outside of the Battle Pass, and they're still attainable today. Why the Chocobo GP detour? The reality is that most of the time I played Babylon's Fall, the paid currency services were no longer available. What I can say is that in the time I spent with the game initially at launch, paying real money didn't seem to give any real major benefits. The Battle Pass provided extra resources and occasional rare items. The real money store did seem to offer some materials for crafting, but in my dozens of hours of playing the game afterwards, I never felt like I was lacking in such a way that I would be forced to buy something. The rest of the items seemed to be cosmetics, which in my eyes at least today, that's pretty acceptable. So while I can't 100% say for sure, I see very little evidence of the claimed excessively impressive systems pushing you to pay more money. If anything, the focus on constantly raising your gear score de-emphasizes this element until you reach the tippy top of the gear chain. Though again, understanding the optics can be important to understanding why people felt this way. I'm someone who has never taken beat 'em up seriously because they're always filled with that nagging feeling in the back of my head that developers would try to make cheap deaths as a way to pull more money out of you. I've had people argue otherwise, and I think at this point, I can feel confident in saying I overly blame these elements in that genre. So if you're missing a material to craft something in Babylon's Fall and see it more easily accessible sitting in the paid store, I can understand why someone would have an excessive reaction to that. Like with Chocobo GP, people are not wrong for criticizing this business model. Why this perception is there in the first place is also understandable, but it feels like the anger around it gets out of control, often ending up with people lashing at the game itself in ways that logically doesn't make a lot of sense. So who is to blame for all these troubles? Platinum Games? Square Enix? Lazy developers? Greedy CEOs? Well, I'm sure you've heard various shades of answers out there. Square Enix has definitely been the focus of Babylon Fall's backlash. I've heard many conversations about how the game never should have been funded in the first place if Square Enix wasn't committed to making it the best game possible. However, I disagree. I'm no developer, but I feel like I can confidently say that few video games start with the intention of being bad. Even so, when something doesn't seem like it's coming together, when do they pull the plug? At the first sign of trouble? The last weeks of development? Who determines it's bad? The developers? CEOs? Playtesters? I'm not saying they can't make judgments, but it's likely not always clear how things will work out from the start of the project. And in the modern day, with software updates, there are opportunities even after launch to sway the experience. As much as people give Square Enix trouble, as a player, I prefer their approach of pushing games through development from start to finish. Most of these titles would have been helped by putting more time or budget, but if the choices are to release, cancel, or never consider making it in the first place, I'd much rather have them put it out and let me decide for myself if I want to play it. As the years have gone by, typical publishers of Square Enix size have become more conservative with what they make, tightening the belts of their lineup and trimming riskier projects. Whether that's a bad trend is subjective, but I personally like games that try new things or take distinct approaches. I don't want titles that have been market tested to death or aim only to deliver exactly what the players are asking for. Square Enix, while clearly keeping a budget on most of these titles, at least delivers on trying these new types of projects. It's easy to berate things like The Quiet Man after the fact, given its abysmal reception. But as a title featuring a deaf protagonist, I think it's a fascinating question to ask how that affects your video game, what subduing and eliminating sound does to the gameplay experience. So few games from publishers of this scale ask what a physical disability can mean for how a game is designed. Even when making games that are clearly driven by chasing trends in the industry or leveraging their most recognizable brands for financial reasons, Square Enix rarely settles for simple reskins and often asks fascinating questions like, what does a Final Fantasy shooter look like? And then what if it had an online mode? What is a Dragon Quest Battle Royale? Or a Platinum Games multiplayer action RPG? These moves often look odd and questionable with full hindsight. Many people will use their failures to drive their narrative of how they clearly knew better than everyone involved, but there are times when the games we love come out of these missteps. I don't think the original Nier exists with strict market testing that determines which games live or die. And it begs the question of, does Nier Automata even happen then? How many years was Final Fantasy XI labeled as a mistake, and that locking a Final Fantasy behind a subscription was a greedy move by Square Enix? Today, a Final Fantasy MMO is one of the biggest successes in the modern industry. There have been so many odd and interesting titles from Square Enix over the years, some that have led to success, but many more that die in obscurity. And as somebody who cares about archiving, it's a nightmare since Square Enix is shutting down failed live service games non-stop, but at least they existed in the first place. Don't get me wrong, Square Enix isn't a charity. I'm not saying you should feel sympathy for a faceless, multi-million-dollar company. They absolutely do this because they want your money and find this to be the best way to get it. I realize it's hard to make the separation between this and the passionate people who make up the developer themselves. I'm sure every individual on these teams cares more or less about one project over another. Unfortunately, our human nature is often to have fun at the expense of others, but when it all builds up to this critical point, I think it's a bit disrespectful as a whole to focus on boiling down every misstep as a result of people being lazy, greedy, or stupid, especially since we don't always know under what circumstances these decisions were made. Thankfully, this is where most of those decade-later retrospectives come into play, free of the contemporary discussion, and instead looking at how a title's development impacted a developer or provided a stepping stone for something bigger. As tacky as Lost, Forgotten, or other YouTube hype keywords can be, the people who take the time to revisit titles give a better understanding of how developers, genres, as well as the industry as a whole evolves. It helps people care about these games by showing them in a new light. Though in saying this, I worry some people who know my work might think I'm saying this about myself. I feel weird about that, and I do not know if I agree, but I'll let you decide if I'm worthy of that sort of praise. I just want to tell you to play the hit dress-up fashion game Happy Dance collection. The point here is to compliment other people here who do great jobs, though Babylon's Fall is a part of a trend that makes these revived discussions a bit harder. Without the official server or some sort of fan intervention, Babylon's Fall is no longer playable. Did it need to be online only? It at least seems unnecessary to me, though many more games are taking the online-only approach either way. No matter what you think about that, titles are dying left and right with few options to revisit them. Many people try their best to breathe new life into these games however they can by hosting private servers, rebuilding entire experiences sometimes, or simply extensively documenting them as much as they can. With the sheer number of service games out there in the modern day though, it's impossible to save them all. That doesn't mean think pieces won't be written, or that someone won't take the time to reevaluate them as best they can. Babylon's Fall is forever a part of Platinum Games history. As long as they're relevant, someone will dig it up from its grave. How they react, sympathetically, appalled, endearingly, or outraged, will most likely only come from secondhand accounts. Many of these games don't have a decade or more to recoup their image and be enjoyed by new audiences with fresh eyes. While we can only do so much to prevent that, I do think something we all can do is foster healthier conversations earlier on. That isn't about ignoring the faults of Babylon's Fall, demonizing its critics, or delegitimizing the values that led to the response at the game's release. It's about making sure that we as a community don't transform completely valid video games into these irredeemable catastrophes where a single drop of respect can't be shown for them or the people who worked on them. Though I'm actually kind of happy Babylon's Fall died as soon as it did. As someone who does not have the time for live games, I would have never played it if it built up years of content. The point of this video isn't to convince you that my feelings on Babylon's Fall, live service games, Square Enix, or anything else are right. My hope is that you understand where I'm coming from. I want you to think of this video the next time a game, development team, or fanbase is being aggressively demeaned on public display. There's more to games than simply what they offer to the most marketable audience of players today. It's easy to let our human emotions get the best of us. Myself included, trust me. There are many videos in the past I've done that I'm not particularly proud of, but I want release day commentary to be interesting and nuanced. Yes, they're products, yet they're also art. A decade is a long time to wait to have conversations about the latter, so let's do it earlier while trying to recognize the emotional blinders that can come with our current values. Take video games seriously, but in smart and compassionate ways.